You mentioned, I mean, one of the most famous leaders in terms of polar expeditions was Shackleton, right? And if you remember, I sent you a message, was it a couple of months back? We were in transit in the UK, no?
Yeah.
And we saw a new book, another leadership book about Shackleton, putting him on a pedestal and saying how great he was and all of this stuff. And then it's interesting, I've just read your book, and then off the back of that, I was like, okay, that's just not true.
I mean, not true. It's a bit of a, you know, there's room for interpretation here. But yes, I would argue, and I do argue in my book, that he is the wrong leader, or he's the wrong person to profile in a book about leadership. If you want to read about an exciting near-death dramatic experience a la Hollywood, then he's your guy. So not taking anything away from the drama in his life and his story. No, and why do I say that? I think he's well known for the endurance expedition set off in 1914. The ship was frozen in place, and he and his men had to brave some pretty scary and harrowing months before they made it back to safety. And certainly there, I think once in that crisis, he displayed some real good leadership qualities. But I still say he's not the right person to learn from, because if we look at his career, he went to the Antarctic 4 times. Every time was a failure and a near catastrophe or a catastrophe. 1907, similar story. Very lucky that they made it away alive. During the endurance expedition, there was a second ship. This is rarely talked about in all the books that celebrate him, the Aurora. Even graver crisis, 3 people died there. And so, his track record is not the type that I would say we need to know what this guy was doing right, because he was clearly doing many things wrong. And so I contrast that with Raul Amundsen, who I think we don't even have to think about polar expedition per se. If you look in any field, I don't think there's anybody who was so dominant the way he was in polar exploration. If we look in sports or anything else, like nobody can touch his record of leadership and record of success in polar exploration. So if we want to learn from somebody, that's the guy.
So it's curious, isn't it? Why we don't talk about him when it comes to leadership and expeditions? Why do we talk about Shackleton?
So I think there's many different ways to study leadership, right? And a lot of the contemporary leadership studies and theories are quite sophisticated and quite nuanced. But there's also a very widespread methodology, if we can call it that, of extracting lessons from historical characters. And I feel like there we have this bias, I call it the action fallacy, that when we look back to pick out a leader to profile in history, we kind of lose all this nuance that we have when we're looking around the world today, and we go for the guy, and usually it is a guy who just had the most dramatic circumstances and made the most noise and was the most action-oriented. Even if, as is the case for Shackleton, the reason there were so many dramatic circumstances is because they were self-inflicted, right? In Amundsen, we kind of have the opposite. If you read his diaries and you read about his expeditions, it's actually pretty boring reading, because it worked out exactly the way he planned it. And there were obviously some things turned out differently. Excuse me. He had to think on his feet. But even then, he made good decisions based on his research and based on his very authentic leadership style that also involved the input and the strengths of the people he was traveling with. And so his trips were pretty unremarkable, except that they were successful.
Yes, so it looks like this human need for entertainment and living some excitement through the stories. But then also...
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking also, who was writing stories, and women at the time were not, well, they couldn't do much, could they? They were not even allowed to be educated most of the time. So it does make sense that we portray characters that look like us, well, people who are writing it, but then also, as Peter said in the beginning, it's the British colonialism at the time, and who is louder, who is more prominent, who publishes more, and all of that. Yeah,
exactly. But Mira, I think you bring up a really interesting parallel point, which is that I think we have this bias, this action fallacy. We like the people who made the most noise, the best stories, the most Hollywood-esque characters. But you're also right that both Amundsen and Shackleton were white men, so there we choose the one who was the most action-oriented of the two, when we should be looking at Amundsen. But overall, the problem with history, as you say, is that we don't have such a detailed written record for a lot of the people who lived and a lot of people who influenced the course of history. So there's a lot of great leaders among, say, enslaved communities and among women in various movements in various regions of the world, where I'm convinced we could write really compelling leadership case studies, but there's just not the material there for us to do that with. So that is the problem. You have to work with what you have, and usually it is the white guys who wrote down everything they were doing, and therefore it's easier to go back and trace their lives and their decisions.